go. All right, so good morning. So today for MEFA's webinar for school counselors, we're going to talk about counseling families with unique financial circumstances. We have a panel of experts on the line who are going to be doing most of the talking today. But my name is Stephanie Wells. I work here at MEFA, so I'll be moderating the panel today. And I've been at MEFA since 2001, so going on 19 years in March. And I've been doing work in the higher ed financing industry since I got out of college in '94. So I do a lot of work with community-based organizations, high schools, colleges, lots of seminars in the community. So I do a little bit of everything here at MEFA. And again, just to let you know, if you need PDP points, certificates of attendance for those who are just logging in, just let me know. Okay, let me just take care of one thing. We have our panelists. Let's see here. Sorry, folks, I'm just trying to deal with the technical issue. All right, so I think we have Kevin on the line. Kevin, can you hear us?
Sorry about that.
Hello?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Great. All right, so let's
Awesome.
get started. Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so here are our panelists, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their institution. And I'm going to start off with Chelsea from Clark University.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Stephanie. My name is Chelsea Adams, and I am the Senior Associate Director of Financial Aid here at Clark University. Clark is a private liberal arts research institution with about 2,300 undergrads and 1,000 grad and PhD programs. Approximately 89% of our undergraduate students do receive some form of financial aid. And just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I've been in higher ed since 2001 and specifically in financial aid since 2004. So the majority of my career in financial aid, mostly at private four-year institutions, but I have done a bit of consulting work. Most recently, I had an extended consulting spot at Mount Wachusett Community College in Gardner. So certainly ask me questions about the private sector, but I can answer some questions about community college as well.
Great, thank you, Chelsea. And Susan from Wheaton College.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Susan Beard, and I've been in the private sector my whole entire financial aid career, and have dealt with many, many special circumstances. So I hope you all have lots of great questions and scenarios, because between the three of us, I'm sure we've encountered all of them and then some. Wheaton, for those of you who don't know, is in southeastern Massachusetts. We have roughly 1,700, almost 1,800 actually now, full-time enrolled students. We are primarily residential campus in Norton. We are a high-cost institution, but our net price is actually much lower than our sticker price. And this past year, our students paid a little bit under, on average, a little under $30,000 in comparison to our almost $70,000 sticker price. So we're pretty proud about that. We try to meet need as much as we can for most of our students. We can't do it for everybody, but we do as much as we can with our resources. And approximately 70% of our students are on some kind of financial assistance.
Great, thank you, Susan. And Kevin.
Hi, good morning. I'm Kevin DeRusi. I'm the Assistant Director at Salem State University, and I oversee all of our special programs and populations as well as compliance. So Salem State University is a mid-sized four-year public school on the North Shore. We have about 6,000 undergrad students and around 2,000 graduate students. 95% of all of our students, undergrad and grad, receive some sort of financial aid. And we have a Pell population. About 52% of our students receive Pell Grant.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I've been in financial aid about 18 years. Prior to that, I was a high school guidance counselor. So I feel all of your pain that are watching this, and welcome.
Thank you, Kevin and Chelsea and Susan. For those of you who are new working with MEFA, just to give you a few tips of additional resources for yourself and your families. You have a copy of this PowerPoint, so I won't go through every bullet point here. But our 800 number is always available 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, for families to call who need help throughout the entire college process, including admissions questions, savings questions, and loans. And we also have an email, collegeplanning@mefa.org. So feel free to send families our way if they need help, or if you're trying to get in touch with us on behalf of a family. And again, we also have these types of webinars for families, and you can see the link for school counselors if you want to take a look at any of the recorded webinars that we have available, as well as any upcoming webinars. So here's the basic primary topics that we're going to talk about. We'll get into a little bit more detail in each of them, of course. We're going to talk about independent students, what makes a student independent, and probably more commonly, what doesn't make a student independent, which families might request that students become independent, but they're not able to. Undocumented students, when I was reviewing the questions for today from the registrants, we had a lot of questions about undocumented students, so we'll talk about that. Non-traditional parent families, all sorts of details to get into there. And lastly, special circumstances, what colleges usually consider or will consider as far as financial aid appeals, and also the process. How does that process work? And so we'll talk about each of the individual schools on the line, then they'll talk about their individual processes as well. Okay, so federally independent students. For independent students, no parent information is collected on the FAFSA form, which in many cases, or most cases, might make them more eligible for more aid. But there are certain criteria that they have to say yes to on the FAFSA in order to be considered independent. So we have that list of criteria right here. So you can read through that. Some of the common ones might be that they're married, or they're a graduate student, they're in the military. They may have a child of their own, and the other one, foster care anytime after age 13. So that's a key. It has to be after age 13. Emancipated minor or in legal guardianship. An unaccompanied youth who is homeless or at the risk of being homeless. So we often get questions at financial aid nights about the legal guardianship in particular. You know, if it's a grandmother who is, taking care of the student, should the grandmother put their information on the FAFSA? So we'll get into a little bit of that detail. So why don't I start with Susan about dependency overrides, or actually, Kevin, I think we were going to start with you on this one. I apologize. Dependency overrides. If you want to just kind of go through this slide a little bit and talk about situations where students, you might hear they don't qualify, but they think they might be able to, and ones that you do come across more often at Salem State. And then we'll talk to Chelsea and Susan about any additional points that they would like to make.
Definitely. So one of the largest inquiries we get from students is, why do I need to have my parents' information on the FAFSA? They don't support me. I live on my own. I have my own job. So basically, as Stephanie said, the federal Department of Education does have guidelines of what they consider dependent and independent. So students who would not qualify for a dependency override are the ones that the parents refuse to contribute or provide data. Parents won't claim or don't claim the student on their taxes, or they have their own full-time job, they're living on their own. Students who do qualify, if a student discloses that they're in an abusive household, it's unsafe for them to go home. If they've been abandoned, their parents are incarcerated or institutionalized, parents are lacking physical and mental capacity, or they just don't know where their parents are. Those are the ones that we focus on gathering additional information and, hopefully being able to make them independent. one of the biggest things I tell students that are looking for independent status is it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get additional financial aid. It opens you up for additional loan money, and it also just makes the process easier because you don't need to put your parents' information on the FAFSA. So at Salem State, the ones I deal with are the dependency overrides as well as the homeless students, and they're definitely different. Dependency override, we require documentation from the student. Typically, it's 3 letters explaining the circumstances, one from the student, one can be from another relative, and the third party, we typically want them to give us something from a disinterested third party, a clergy person, a therapist, a doctor, anything like that. Those we review as a team here at Salem State to make the determination whether or not the documentation provided, meets the criteria, at which point, if it's approved, we'll go in, change the student's FAFSA, remove the parent information, and just make that student independent, recalculate their estimated family contribution, and award them accordingly. Students that are unaccompanied, homeless, or at risk of homelessness, federal law states that we are not required, nor should we ask students for any documentation beyond if they have a letter from a shelter or from a high school guidance counselor has declared them homeless. On our end, it's a conversation I have with the student, one-on-one, in person, usually about a half hour, 45 minutes. I take a few notes. I determine whether or not they are, in fact, homeless, at risk of being homeless, or they are completely unaccompanied. And at that point, we adjust their FAFSA and make them independent so that we can process their aid.
That's great, Kevin. And we did have a question. And so I just wanted to encourage folks, if you have questions, to write those in the chat feature. And we will answer those as we go. And the question was actually something that you just answered. So the specific question was, how can a student make a request for dependency override on the FAFSA, which you just answered on behalf of Salem State, Kevin. But I was wondering, Chelsea, if you might want to provide a little bit more information at Clark of how students, and I believe you have the CSS profile. I don't know if that comes into play for dependency overrides as well.
Yes, absolutely, Stephanie. So here at Clark, if a student is seeking to pursue a dependency override, then there's really nowhere on the FAFSA that they're going to say that. Really, the only place that they might do that on the FAFSA is they can opt to submit their FAFSA without parental data, and they have to confirm at the time of FAFSA submission, yes, I'm submitting this without parental data. And then we would encourage that student to reach out to Clark and say, hey, I submitted this without parental data, and here's why. What do I need to do to be considered an independent student, because I'm not otherwise considered independent. So each school is going to have its own process. So we would encourage that student to reach out to any institution to which they're submitting a financial aid application, reach out to that financial aid office and find out specifically what that school's process is. I can tell you, also from a community college background, I did come across a few students who did submit their FAFSA in that fashion, parents' refusal to provide information on the FAFSA. And at that point, the student didn't qualify for a dependency override because it was just the parents' refusal to provide the data on the application. But in that case, we were able to offer the student a fully unsubsidized federal student loan. So they will qualify for that if their parents fail to provide the information on the FAFSA, and we're aware of that. However, in the community college setting, a federal student loan can go a long way with the tuition and fees being relatively low. At a private institution, not so much. That's really going to be probably a deal breaker for that student if they can't provide parental information and a dependency override isn't otherwise warranted. They're really going to be stuck in being able to move forward and financially be able to afford that institution. One thing I wanted to talk about too is a little bit was brought up, the homelessness. I did find at the community college, oftentimes we'd have students that we called couch hoppers. So they weren't in a shelter. There was, no letter that they could get from their high school guidance counselor. They weren't officially homeless, but there was some reason why they were not at home and why they were relying on friends, relatives, neighbors to provide them with housing. And it wasn't stable housing. It might be a different place every night. Those were a little bit more difficult for the student to document and for the institution to be able to fully consider for a dependency override. So as Kevin mentioned, documentation is always what the institution is going to need to move forward in these cases for dependency overrides. And so if there isn't a situation that's kind of cut and dry, it becomes a little bit more difficult, but we still want that student to reach out to us and let us know what's going on because we may know of resources or options that are available to that student.
Yeah, this is great, Chelsea. And I do want to let the attendees know on the webinar that we do have a recorded webinar with some colleagues at DCF. We usually do this webinar every other year, I'm sorry, about how to help foster youth throughout this process. So it goes through a great amount of detail from our friends over at DCF that might be useful if you guys want to get into this specific topic in even more detail. Definitely take a listen to that webinar. It would be really helpful for you. And Susan, do you come across this much? Maybe parents who refuse, or the mom, maybe the dad refuses to fill out the profile, or how does that what happens at Wheaton?
So I really a lot of what Kevin said, a lot of what Chelsea said is exactly what Wheaton does. As a private college, we probably have less homeless students that are applying, but we have a fair share. And I liked, I guess in a way, Chelsea's couch hopper scenario, because that's more commonly what we find, students that for one reason or another are not able to live at home, but they're not in a shelter, they're living with friends or aunts or and whatnot. We collect the same amount of data that Kevin asked for. We really like documentation. We need documentation. But I think the overarching message would be to have these students make contact with an officer, not just, and it goes further than sending an email sometimes. We, as a rule, we'll ask everybody, all of our applicants, for parental and student data, and that's either, if they don't reach out to us, we'll never know that they can't provide parental information, and we don't want them to get kind of stuck in the process. The toughest one, like Chelsea said, I think Chelsea said this, is the refusal of parents. Sometimes we'll see a student will tell us, my parents, or my father, my mother, whatnot, want me to go to a state school, and therefore they refuse to fill out the profile or the FAFSA with Wheaton's name on it. So those are really difficult ones. And while they feel independent, they feel all alone, we can't do that override for them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so this slide pretty much summarizes a lot of what we just spoke about, the types of documentation that schools will need. And of course, school counselors, I'm sure you've had to provide this documentation to help students out. And I would also encourage you, if you are working with a student, there are privacy concerns with the colleges, so they might not be able to speak to you directly, but about the details of the student, but I'm sure, having your assistance and reaching out, we get calls from counselors all the time, just who are trying to help students to get advice on what to do next. So I encourage you, if you are able to do that for students, to go ahead and help them through this process, because the students better than the colleges do, so they might need your assistance. Okay, undocumented students. Now, I know we had a lot of questions about this, and I do have a lot of resources here for you that we'll show you on the upcoming screen. And these situations have been very difficult, particularly over the last few years with students. Maybe the student is undocumented, or maybe the parents are undocumented, and sometimes a student is a U.S. resident citizen. So we hear about all sorts of different scenarios. So I'm going to turn it over. I'll start with you, Kevin, if you want to just talk a little bit about the situations you come across at Salem State and resources that are available for them, particularly at a state institution.
Sure. So one of the key issues with working with DACA students is we don't know they're on campus. A lot of them do not disclose out of fear, and most of the DACA students that we're aware of in the financial aid office, they're typically referrals from our leadership engagement and diversity office, or a professor will reach out to us and say, I have a student in my class, they have no books, they have no financial aid, they're undocumented, what can we do? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of institutional money that we give to DACA students because we are state run, we have to follow the rules and regulations, but we do have money from private donors. It's a very small scholarship and it is very limited. Right now, I believe we have about 10 students that are receiving a $1,000 scholarship. We did implement last year for any DACA students living on campus a non-need-based housing grant. If they need additional funds to live on campus, that's up to $4,000 a year. Again, overall price, it's not making a huge dent, but it does help to get them closer to where they need to be. There are great resources, and I believe, Stephanie, you have them in this PowerPoint towards the end for undocumented students that are out there. It's different scholarships, different agencies that will help students find funding or find support. Like I said, the key issue is we don't know who they are for the most part because they do kind of keep a low profile out of fear. And we rely on, the campus community, our professors and our diversity office and other staff people to let us know that we have a DACA student who is struggling to make their payment, make their bill.
Okay, great. And I've also put on the screen the details about DACA students and what is considered a DACA student. So they do have to meet certain criteria. So that's a little bit different than typical, regular undocumented student. It's a little bit of a different situation. And in Massachusetts, as Kevin referred to, they do have some benefits, such that they can get the Adams Scholarship and they can get that in-state tuition, which, they might be able to get through, going to community college for a couple of years and then transferring. That might be really helpful. So we do have resources in Massachusetts for them. Chelsea, do you want to talk a little bit more about undocumented students?
Yes, absolutely. So Clark University actually has a healthy number of undocumented students. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe word's gotten out, or the fact that we're in an urban setting. I'm not quite sure what it is, but ultimately, students are applying for admission here, and at the time of admission are indicating whether or not they're applying for financial aid or they intend to apply. And what ends up happening is we don't get a FAFSA from that student, even though they've indicated that they're applying. So we send a reminder and we send a reminder. And typically a conversation comes out of that, well, I'm not submitting the FAFSA, I'm undocumented, So what we'll do is we have a way of coding those students, and we'll go in and waive that FAFSA requirement for them. Clark does require submission of the CSS profile application in addition to the FAFSA. So we will collect those undocumented students wishing to apply for financial aid. We'll collect their information through receipt of the profile application. And so for us, when we're looking at those students to determine, should they be admitted and what type of aid will they receive, we are very much need aware with our population of undocumented students because the only type of financial aid that they're going to receive is institutional aid directly from Clark or perhaps some private sources of funding. We cannot fully fund those students. So if they are very high need, because we're need aware, we might not admit them because we say we're not able to fund this student. But if the family does have the means and we're able to see that we could fund them institutionally, then we will offer institutional cost scholarships to those students. And many of those students then do enroll. And just from, I've been here at Clark for a little bit less than a year, and I've looked at the scholarship amounts for those undocumented students, and they're quite healthy. I've seen a $30,000 scholarship out there for students. And granted, they're not getting the Pell Grant, they're not getting Stafford loans, they're not getting those other sources of federal and state funding. So they're really relying on the institution in order to be able to enroll.
Great, thank you, Chelsea. Susan, did you have anything to add on this topic? Or
we don't, Stephanie. To Chelsea's point about being in an urban setting, in Norton, we don't really have too many, for whatever reason, students that are undocumented applying. Every once in a while we do, and if they have a sponsor or some resource, we are sometimes able to help them meet the need in order to afford it. But unfortunately, that's usually a rare situation. So until we get our $1 trillion donor, we won't be able to fund our undocumented applicants, unfortunately.
Right, I hear you. Great, thank you. So I'm trying to click on, I might have to send everybody the link. A resource, here it is, the resource guide for supporting undocumented youth. And this is a 53-page document, but it is pretty robust. It was put out by the Department of Education 2015. So some of the information might be a little stale in there, but it's, from what I've talked to with folks, it's still a very helpful document. So you might want to take a look at this, and I can send the link if you're interested, at least to have a bookmark on resources that are available through the Department of Education. I think we always promote that document as a resource for counselors. And I also just wanted to touch upon a couple of other things for undocumented students. I believe it was Chelsea who mentioned the multicultural department. If there's one on campus, I know our friends at DCF often encourage students who might be undocumented or DACA students to reach out to the multicultural recruiting coordinator on the campus. There's usually a department of some sort, and they can be a good support for the student. When they're researching colleges, look at the college's mission. Maybe ask questions of the admissions office to see, what kind of support systems might there be, or financing for students. And safety schools, sometimes merit scholarships are available that don't depend on citizenship. So those are all things that should be looked at as part of the admissions process before a student even applies to a college, to make sure that they're giving themselves some resources and options that could be financially safer or closer to it for the student. So it's not just the public colleges where they might be able to get instant tuition if they're DACA, but it's also some private colleges. There are, if you have a student who's high achieving, there are private colleges out there that don't look at citizenship whatsoever and might meet full need. Those might be the Ivy Leagues, and might be hard to get into, of course, but there are schools out there for those high achieving students as well. So the whole admissions process is very important for these students to be a part of and to think about. So this slide right here, I'm not going to go through any of these links. I'm just going to leave this here for you. We've done a little bit of research on resources for undocumented students, different advocacy groups and private funding sources that you might want to be aware of and pass on to students. We have some blogs that are online as well. So there are resources out there. So I encourage everybody to take a look and share with students and families at your school. Okay, so non-traditional parent families. I am going to start this one with Kevin. I'll get back to you, Kevin, in a minute. And if you want to just start talking about some of the situations you see, and then we'll talk to Chelsea and Susan as well when it comes to the non-traditional parent families and what sorts of obstacles or questions do they usually have?
Sure. One of the largest questions that we see here is who fills out the FAFSA? And the federal regulation states the parent who's the custodial parent is determined by the parent that has custody of the student 51% of the year, which if they're sharing custody, it's really hard to figure out 51%. So at that point, we just kind of put it to the parents to say, you guys figure out who wants to fill out the FAFSA. We don't guide them. We don't say which one of you makes less money, but most of the parents will figure out who would be the best parent to fill out the FAFSA. That is the most typical situation we see here. And in talking to my panel mates yesterday afternoon when we were prepping this, one of the situations that's been arising for all of us are divorced or separated parents who are still living in the same household. That becomes really messy on a financial aid standpoint for filling out the FAFSA and for determining whose information should be on it. Some cases it's a little bit easier. It could be a two-family home and one parent is living upstairs, one parent is living downstairs. But we do have a number of students whose parents are still living in the same household despite being divorced or separated. That takes a one-on-one conversation, well, a one-on-two conversation with both parents to figure out whose information, who's going to claim the student on their taxes, how are they going to file their taxes, are they legally separated, are they in the process of a divorce? If they are in the process of a divorce or they are legally separated, we'll ask for documentation of that separation. If it's sort of just a verbal, we're no longer together, even though we're living together, we request that they fill out a statement, write out a statement, get it notarized, and send it to us. And then we let them, again, decide who's going to be on the FAFSA, because in that sort of case, it's hard to determine who is the custodial parent and who isn't.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Susan, do you want to touch upon this, and particularly the profile and how the non-custodial profile works? Because there has been some changes over the last couple of years with that process.
Sure. Yep. So Wheaton, like a lot of other private colleges, will request information not only from the custodial, but also the non-custodial parent. Sometimes that's not a difficult task for a family to provide, and other times it is. So we usually rely on our families to get in touch with us, and if the non-custodial parent information is unavailable, we will ask for documentation. We actually have a waiver form that we have them fill out. I believe the College Board also has a waiver form, so sometimes we see that form as well, and we'll use it in place of our own institutional waiver request form. But we ask not only that the custodial parent and the student provide a statement, but also a or I think as Kevin put it, a disinterested third party, so that a clergy person, a social worker, many times it's a guidance officer, so thank you for those out there who have done this before, to provide some kind of additional verification that to your knowledge, there's no contact or there's no involvement or especially no financial resources available from a non-custodial parent, and we will happily waive that requirement with the proper documentation.
Excellent, thank you. And I actually had a parent 2 days ago who had a lot of profile schools on the list, and it was kind of a messy separation and fighting over money and all that kind of stuff. So it was a challenging situation where the non-custodial parent was refusing to fill out the profile form because he only wanted the student to go to a public college and pay for half of that cost. So it's a kind of a difficult situation, but I did tell the custodial parent, with this new non-custodial form, the non-custodial parent logs in separately. All the information is completely separate so that each parent does not see the other's financial information. And I think sometimes that might be the reason why maybe the non-custodial parent or custodial parent don't want to share information, at least from the conversations I've had.
If I can jump in, we sometimes we'll have custodial parents ask us to reach out to the non-custodial and explain that, and that can be a difficult spot. We don't want to get in the middle of a family dynamic a lot of the time, but it's true when we explain to the student or the custodial parent that things are separate, things are confidential, and also that it's not a binding agreement that they're going to pay us anything. We just simply need the information. And if at the end of the day, all of that is not working, we do, depending on the situation and the student applicant, we may waive that information, but assign a contribution from a non-custodial parent. And we'll tell that to families too. And sometimes that makes the non-custodial parent say, oh, okay, well, maybe my contribution would end up being lower than what they're going to assign. I might as well fill out the stuff. So
Right.
that's just another kind of quirk to the system.
Thank you, Susan.
One other thing that we see is when a parent remarries, and because the FAFSA is based on income from 2 years ago, if they were divorced and recently got married in the last year or two prior to the year that the FAFSA is using, or after the year the FAFSA was using, we do require the step-parent's financial information. Even if it's not included on the FAFSA, if they're selected for verification and they list that step parent in the household, we require the step parent's information, and very often we get well, they're not supporting my child, they didn't adopt my child, we just got married, and we have to explain to them that the FAFSA is based on 2 years ago. However, you're selected for verification, and we need the picture of the family as of today. And that becomes a struggle because a lot of times, we're talking children that are 18, 19 years old. The adopted parent really doesn't have, not adopted, the step parent doesn't really have an obligation to support that, but we need that information. We need the full picture of the family's income when we're processing financial aid.
Great.
Right. Good point, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. We do have one question, so I'll throw this over to Chelsea that really touches upon what Kevin was just saying. So I'll just read the question if you want to tackle this one, Chelsea. When parents are looking at the FAFSA in prior year, does the parent who claimed the student on their taxes in that year need to complete the FAFSA? We get this question all the time about divorce agreements. Well, this is what it says, and well, that person claimed them, but I didn't, and oftentimes it's irrelevant. So Chelsea, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really great question. And I think it's a question that you say really comes up quite frequently. So whoever is claiming that student as an exemption on the taxes, that is really unrelated to who is the custodial parent and who is the parent on the FAFSA. So a lot of times, parents and families think that those are related. If I claim that student, then I'm the custodial parent. And if the other parent does, then they're the custodial parent. But truly, the definition of that custodial parent is who did that child live with more in the last 12 months? And it doesn't matter if one person claimed that student as the exemption if they lived with the other parent. It's always going to go, who are you living with? And then as Kevin said, if it's 50-50, half the time with one parent, half the time with another parent, then we look to the financial support. Who is providing more financial support to that student? And so if you can't make the decision based on who the student lives with, then you're going to say, all right, that custodial parent is the parent who's providing more financial support. We do also run into this quite frequently, and sometimes we discover the error because a student's application is selected for verification, and other times not. I'm sure we don't know, but parents seem to answer the question regarding their marital status as to what their marital status is with the student's biological parent. So, for example, I just spoke to a non-custodial parent of an applicant yesterday, and I happen to know that he's remarried. And I said, hey, I think you filled this out wrong. I thought you said you were married, but you're reporting on this application that you're divorced. And he said, yeah, I'm divorced from the student's mom. I said, yes, but as of today, you are married to someone, correct? Oh, yeah. I said, well, you were supposed to report married, and you were supposed to include that that step parent, that new spouse's information on this application, you know, the demographic information, income, assets, none of that had been included. So I think that applicants, especially parents, really struggle with when it's asking them what their marital status is, they're oftentimes referring back to the marital status with the student's biological parent, not their marital status of today. And truly the question is asking, what is your marital status today? And I know FAFSA, if you actually look at the instructions for that question, it will say, you know, if you are remarried, include your new spouse's information here. But I think a lot of people just don't refer to those instructions. So it can get a little bit tricky. And as Kevin says, if the application is selected for verification and they fill out a household size form that now shows a step parent that you weren't previously aware of, it really can open a can of worms for that applicant.
Great. Thank you, Chelsea. And I also just want to highlight this poster that I have on the screen that you can order from the Department of Ed. So you might want to have this hang up in the counseling office. I'll send out the full PowerPoint along with the recording of the webinar so that you can access the links versus a PDF of the PowerPoint, because there's all those scholarship links as well in that resource guide. So let's talk about appeals, special circumstances, especially, you know, the things that you do consider and usually don't, and the process as well. We'll get into that. So I'll have you start, Susan, if you don't mind, to talk about, you know, when you use professional judgment and how that process might work and what situations are typically taken into account.
Sure. So I always, when families come to us and say, you know, I just answered 458 questions on the FAFSA and the profile, but yet I don't feel like my situation is coming through. We agree with them and we'll say, yep, there are some things that don't show up on a tax return or in these applications that we have you toil over. So we have a couple of avenues that we ask families to take. Either write us a letter, or oftentimes it's an email, and explain what truly happened in the year 2018 or 2019, whichever tax year that we're collecting. Many times, probably the most common is that the year that they're filling out the FAFSA and the profile with the income was 2 years ago, and it's really not what's happening current day. And so we ask them to explain that. I think we're not alone in that we have a projected year income statement where we will oftentimes ask a family to give us their base year tax return. So in this upcoming year, it would be their 2018 tax return, but also fill out this worksheet that shows us what your current year, or even actually your 2019 income was, taxes, if they can get those done quickly or estimate. And we can compare the two, and we help families in that regard really recognize that we're trying our best to recognize a true family's true capacity to pay. We can't do that across the board. We can't make decisions. We, being colleges, can't make professional judgment and apply it to our entire population. It does have to be case by case. And we can ask as much information, and we do ask a lot of times for a lot of detailed information because we are held to certain standards and by our auditors and whatnot. So we have to collect a lot of, sometimes families feel like we're collecting way too much information, but it always in the end is for their benefit. We're trying to get them as eligible as possible for as much aid as possible. So the things that we see, like I said, a year of taxable income that we're collecting does not depict what is truly happening now. Maybe they had a really banner year with their business and that they'll never see that again. Realtors, sometimes that's a fine line because they'll tell us that they had a great year and then you know, they're not going to. It's a little bit of a crystal ball with that in that industry, but you know, maybe they had a medical situation that they had unreimbursed expenses for that they had to pay. We will accept that. At Wheaton, we seem to have a lot of families that are supporting relatives in other countries. And with documentation, sometimes we can reduce their income by the amount of money that they're actually paying to a grandparent or a sibling or someone, I guess it doesn't even have to be in another country, it could be in another household. So those are situations where we will absolutely take into account and use our judgment, and we're able to adjust the FAFSA for the families.
Great, thank you, Susan. Chelsea, can you talk a little bit about the process, at Clark and what sort of things you talk about and documentation you're looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're very much considering the same types of circumstances that Susan described. The appeal process here at Clark, basically, if someone reaches out to either our admissions or financial aid office and says, hey, I've been admitted, I've received this aid, but it's not enough, we generally try to find out why that is. A, did they just not like it? Like, is it equitable? Yes, but they just don't like it and don't want to pay that much. It's one thing. But we really try to tease out of them whether or not there are these circumstances. Was the base year for financial aid that's being used for financial aid an off year, and really it's not representative of their ability to pay, or were there extra expenses, things like that. Some things that we won't consider, an offer of financial aid from another institution. Hey, some other school gave my daughter more money. We're like, okay, that's nice, but we're not that other school. And, perhaps your student falls in a different part of the applicant pool at our institution than they do at that other institution, or we don't even consider that school to be a competing institution. So I would say, generally speaking, schools are not considering offers of financial assistance from other institutions as a form of appeal. But really, we have our formal appeal process. It's an online form. It's not public on our website, but if you ask, hey, I have a question about this, can I appeal? We will always say yes, and we will always give you that website. There's an online form and an opportunity to attach documentation, which we do encourage. Without the documentation, it's really hard to make a decision on an appeal. So if they're talking about fluctuating income, tax documents, or quarterly statements from business are really, really helpful in making that determination. For a merit-based appeal, if the student has basically is more desirable as a candidate now than they were at the time they were admitted and is looking for more merit scholarship money, then we want to see that next round of SAT scores that are better, or we want to see another recommendation, or we want to see that the student has received an award or been acknowledged for something that didn't exist at the time the student initially applied. And so what we're doing here at Clark is any merit-based or international appeals are getting funneled through our admissions office, and any need-based appeals are getting funneled through our financial aid office. And then we have a committee that meets weekly to discuss those appeals and make determinations on those.
Great, thank you, Chelsea. We do have a question, another great question, and I'm going to start with Chelsea, and I'll talk to Kevin and Susan as well. When should a student contact the financial aid office regarding a special circumstance? Immediately after filing the FAFSA profile, or should they wait until they have been admitted and receive a financial aid award? Chelsea, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, that can be a little bit tricky. It depends on the school is really what I'm going to say. A lot of times the school isn't going to consider an appeal until they've reviewed the financial aid application and sent the student a financial aid award, because there's nothing to appeal on if they don't know what the initial offer is. Maybe they'll be pleasantly surprised and say, oh, okay, I don't need to kind of lay out all my personal information to the school more than I have already, because I'm happy with the financial aid that's been offered. So generally speaking, here at Clark, we say wait until you get your financial aid award letter, and then if you feel like it's not representative of your family's ability to pay, then reach out to the school immediately. Something that's really on the student side is time. So for those students who apply, early decision or early action, they're just buying themselves more time to have these conversations, to go through an appeal process, and to figure out financially, is this feasible for me to attend this institution? It gets really tricky when a student applies regular decision and they really, maybe they find out in mid-March that they're admitted and what the aid package is. and then by May 1st need to make a decision. And you might think that 6 weeks is plenty of time, but I can tell you any financial aid office that has that May 1st deadline, that it's crazy. That appeal committee is meeting 3 times a week. There are all of these events going on campus. Everyone's saying, hey, more, more, more. So really, if the student can just start that process as early as possible, like the middle of April, the last week of April, we can't guarantee that we're going to be able to turn around a decision on an appeal. And we're going to tell you, hey, you're going to have to make a decision based on what you have.
Right.
Another thing just to keep in mind as well, some institutions do this, some do not, but as soon as that student pays that deposit, that is really an indication from the student and their family to the school is, I've got this figured out financially. So if you go ahead and submit an appeal after that based on circumstances that you were aware of, I mean, it's not like, oh, I submitted my deposit and the next week my parent lost a job. Yeah, we want to hear about that. You could not have seen that coming. But if a student submits a deposit and then a month later is like, oh, hey, by the way, I'd like to appeal. I got a better offer from another school. We're going to say, well, you made your decision to enroll here based on the offer that you had. So clearly you had it figured out financially, or at least that's the message that's received by institutions, and they may be less likely then to grant additional appeal money to that student.
Right. And I've talked to one of the UMass institutions that wants to get appeals after May 1st because they just don't have a lot of institutional dollars to fill in, even if the appeal is approved. So Kevin, that might be different at Salem State, but can you speak to that as well?
I am drowning in appeals right now. Salem State is the complete opposite. We pretty much tell students to appeal if you need to appeal, or you feel you need to appeal because income has changed from 2 years ago, to appeal as soon as you do your FAFSA. The rationale for that is when we actually go into our awarding sessions and our awarding season, we want a clean FAFSA. So they file the appeal, we do the initial verification, then we do the appeal verification and any adjustments so that when the time comes for us to actually award the student, their FAFSA is clean, the income on it is accurate, and they're getting a clean, solid award letter with what they are truly eligible for. It's a bit of a hassle to do it before awarding, but it actually makes it easier and cleaner on the backside for us because we rely mostly on state and federal funding. We have institutional funding, that's need-based as well. But because we rely more heavily on state and federal, we tend to run out of money sooner through the awarding cycle. So we want a nice, clean FAFSA with accurate numbers so that the students are receiving what they are actually eligible for instead of appealing, in June when a lot of our funds may already be depleted. Because we started awarding freshmen the second to last week in December, and we'll start awarding returning students in mid-March. So by June, we're pretty empty. So we want a nice, clean FAFSA with accurate numbers that definitely reflect the students and the family's income and financial situation before we go out with awards.
Excellent. And Susan, can you speak to this just when you want to hear? And if you wouldn't mind just touching on the negotiating question. And I know we have about a few minutes before 11, so we're going to keep going. It seems to have gone by so quickly already. And I know Chelsea might have to run off to a meeting, so if she does, that's fine. But I just want to give a quick time check, but we're going to keep going. And if you wouldn't mind picking up here, Susan.
Sure. So we actually, like Kevin, we would prefer that if a student had a special circumstances or family has a special circumstance, they let us know. File your FAFSA, file your profile, send us your documentation, and then when we can get them or determine their eligibility, we know that we've gotten them the best package we possibly can. Sure. It doesn't always work out that way, though. Families will do what they're told with FAFSAs and profiles, and we'll give them an award, and then they'll still come back and say, oh, but I forgot to tell you this, or this has come up. So we're kind of just like Kevin, drowning in paperwork for the whole spring, really. And Stephanie, the second part, the negotiating, whenever I hear that word, it's sort of like, oh, it gives me a little chill. It does happen. It depends on the schools. Some schools are very interested in what other colleges are giving, and they will compete, and they will actually come out and say, I would like to see those awards, and let's see what we can do. Typically, it's if a school higher up the food chain gave them a better package, and we want to, college will want to win that student over, then they'll ask for that documentation. But like Chelsea said, usually we try to give as much money out as we possibly can. That's what we're in the business to do. One thing I do like to tell guidance counselors whenever I have an audience is to encourage your students and your families to always ask. There's no harm in asking. The worst we can say is no, and the best we can say is yes, and more than likely we'll say maybe much of the time. If you don't ask, you won't know. And I do have families every time that are afraid. They've come to me and said, but what if I ask for more? Will you take away what I already have? And I don't know why they feel that way, but I get that question every year, and I can assure you, at least at Wheaton, and I'm probably speaking for my colleagues too, we will never take aid away unless we find that we've calculated wrong or that there's been, false information given to us. But just because you ask for more we will never take that away from you. So always, counselors, if the family really wants to go to a college and it's out of their reach, just encourage the ask. There's no harm in that.
Yeah,
we love paperwork.
Yeah, I will definitely tack on to that. I always tell parents, be your child's best advocate. You might think that you're bugging that financial aid office, but what you're doing is you're doing the best thing for your child. And, I am a parent, and I'm going to have in a couple of years my kid's going to college, and maybe I'm going to be that nagging parent that embarrasses my kid for doing this. But I think that you need to do right by your kids. And something that parents may not understand and applicants may not understand is if they have an appeal approved when the student is entering, then likely that increased amount of financial aid will carry forward for the entirety of their undergraduate career. So, hey, they gave me $3,000. No, they just gave you $12,000 because it's $3,000 for 4 years. So definitely worth asking at the time of an appeal if it's granted, if it's just for this 1 year, or if it's renewable and it is good for the entirety of the student's time at that institution. But don't feel badly about asking for more. This is the time to do it, and this is the way that parents are going to put their kids in the best financial position possible.
This is excellent advice, everybody. And I want to spend some time on that because we get those questions all the time, especially negotiating at financial aid nights. So we're going to move into a few more detailed topics. Some of this we'll just touch upon what we haven't talked about already, because some of these situations we may have already talked about. But Susan, would you mind just talking about anything here about changes in income that we haven't talked about already that you might be considering, or things that you've seen?
Yeah, sure. So absolutely, a change in income would be a one-time situation. So if a family gets a bonus, that's awesome. But we know it, or they know it was only one time. Same with an inheritance, or you don't see gambling winnings too often, but every once in a while we do. So what is actually very common, looking at the slide, retirement or pension withdrawal, particularly if they have other kids in college. Families are withdrawing from their 401k and 403bs to finance education or tuition, or maybe replace their roof or whatever it is, and we know that won't happen. We will subtract that type of one-time income inflation out of their income for our calculations. We'll do that for 1 year. We do have families who are living on that type of transaction, so that if they come to us the next year and say, oh, I had to withdraw again for this, that, and the other thing, we tend not to do it over and over again, because they're just really trying to get their income as low as possible every year. But generally speaking, for a one-time occurrence of all of those things on the slide, we will absolutely reduce their income when we calculate their eligibility.
Great. And we do get those questions a lot too about, maybe they were unemployed, so they were, dipping into the retirement, and so it's, it's in their account, so it looks like an asset as well, and it can be a little tricky. So we always advise families to go to financial aid and try and work that out. Kevin, do you have anything that we haven't?
Yeah, I wanted to If the parent is using the IRS data transfer on the FAFSA and they've done an IRA rollover, they should contact the financial aid office because it comes through the FAFSA as just an earning. It does not calculate what was actually rolled over. So they may have rolled over, they may have withdrawn 100,000 and rolled over 90 of that into a new account. It's counting that full 100,000 on the FAFSA. So any parent, if you're working with parents or students, I don't know if students would have it, but if they've done an IRA rollover in that fiscal year, they should really contact the financial aid, and we're going to ask them for a copy of the actual 1040s that show the rollover so that we can remove it from the calculation.
That's a really good point. Chelsea, did you have anything here that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, just as Kevin mentioned, we do see that a lot where they're having this rollover contribution for the IRA, and it's just popping in from use of the data retrieval tool as untaxed income.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't see the data when somebody uses that IRS data retrieval tool on the FAFSA, the data that's retrieved and populated into the FAFSA is masked. The applicant actually can't see what it is. So they might be none the wiser that it's looking like they have all this untaxed income. So as Kevin said, absolutely, if there's any rollover contribution for retirement, reach out to the financial aid office and just make sure that they're aware of it and that it's being calculated correctly.
Great, thank you so much. All right, I think we talked a little bit about this, but it sort of comes into income as well, sort of the same situation. Home repairs, family emergencies, anything we haven't talked about thus far, Chelsea, that might have changes in assets that could change things quite a bit?
Yeah, we don't, I wouldn't say we see this a lot. I think, I'm learning here at Clark that, while our entire student population, they aren't all affluent, I think many of them are. And so I'm just not seeing nearly as many of these situations present themselves. I will refer to my time working at the community college. This was, as Kevin says, he's flooded with appeals. This is the type of situation that we would see all of a sudden, that there's this financial emergency that's impacting the student's ability to be able to afford attendance at that school. And so we would have students submit some documentation, a written statement, and any sort of backup documentation for that. So we could take a look and say, okay, you know what, medical expenses, those are considered in the financial aid formula already. Are the medical expenses you have above and beyond what's already being considered? And if so, then how can we account for them? Or really, they're not. We've already considered them. So it really depends on what the nature of that change in the assets is, and if it's accounted for previously in the formula or not. And we need to go ahead and collect some more information in order to do that.
Great, thank you. Susan, what's the most common changes in assets that you guys see at Wheaton?
Yeah, we really don't see too much. I'm thinking every once in a while we'll have a family that says, we had to sell our home and the proceeds are put in our bank account. We're in an apartment now, but we're about to buy a home in a month. And so that kind of thing is something where we can maybe take into account, because we're a profile school. We do include home equity, so we could kind of shift the amount in their assets and their checking account or savings account into what we would otherwise consider as home equity. So, or not. It really isn't something we see too much. It's mostly the changes in income that we deal with.
Great, thank you. Kevin, anything else to add here?
No, the most popular one we see are the medical and dental bills. We also occasionally get they drew from a home equity to use for home repairs. But again, on the FAFSA, it's showing as income coming in. And what we would do in that circumstance is get documentation of the home repair. So if they withdrew 20 for a new roof that cost 24, give us the bill, we'll remove it from the calculation.
Excellent, great, thank you. Okay, so I know a lot of schools don't consider many of these items as far as household expenses. We do get questions here and there You know, about what if I have my own student loans? Will schools take that into consideration? So Chelsea, can you speak to any of these that you would consider at Clark?
Yeah, I mean, I would say here at Clark, we're really not considering the private elementary or secondary school tuition if that student or sibling is enrolled there by choice and not by necessity. There are circumstances where a student or a sibling does need to be enrolled in a private school due to a medical, emotional, social condition where that private institution could better serve that student. And in that case, we would take a look at it and say, all right, you're doing this out of necessity. You're not just doing it out of choice. Oh, does my kid just want to go to the private Catholic high school because we think he'd have a better shot at getting into X college? No, we're not going to consider that. But truly, if there is a necessity, there's a real need for that student or the student sibling to be in that private school, then that's something that we certainly are going to take a look at. I did touch a little bit on the medical dental bill payments not covered by insurance, and we're going to collect documentation and do a calculation to determine if that's already been accounted for in the financial aid formula or if those expenses are really above and beyond what's already being considered. As far as childcare, nursing home, things like that, those they're a little bit trickier. Here at Clark, we probably wouldn't consider them in determining, say recalculating the student's expected family contribution, but we might use those costs to do a recalculation of the student's cost of attendance. And sometimes if we can increase the student's cost of attendance based on these costs, then that may result in additional financial aid. Typically not free money, but perhaps loan money or an opportunity to work.
Great. And would you see the childcare costs at community college more often?
Yes, we would see those at the community college more often. But to Mount Wachusett Community College's credit, they have a daycare on campus. So a lot of the students could qualify for, there's some kind of voucher, I forget the name of it, but there was some kind of voucher where many times if they could get a spot at that daycare and get a voucher to cover it, then that made the biggest difference for them above and beyond, hey, I didn't get any more financial aid, but I was able to get my child into this on-campus daycare, which is super convenient, is low cost if I've qualified for this voucher. And so maybe they're not getting it in the form of financial aid for their school, but they are getting help.
And I can vouch for my niece when she was in nursing school. She did use that daycare center, which was quite handy. So proud of it now. Susan, do you have anything to add here that we haven't already talked about?
No, everything right alongside my colleagues with those.
Great. And Kevin, how about you? Anything with student loan payments? Do families ask about that? And is it?
No, we mostly see any child care stuff is usually on the graduate student level, and we'll just build it into the budget to increase their cost of attendance, but there's really no additional aid that goes along with it.
Great, thank you. Okay, change in household size. And I just want to put out a quick call for folks to type in their questions because we are coming towards the end. We only have a couple more slides, so feel free to type in your questions now so that we'll be able to get right into those right when we wrap up. Changes in household size. Kevin, do you guys see this very often where families need to make changes mid-year?
Yes, it's typically a grandparent moves in. It's also a sibling who's got an infant or a toddler will move back home, and they'll put in the request to increase the family size, and we work with it from there. Most of the time, we come across these with students that were selected for verification because on the FAFSA, listing three in the house with one in college, we get the verification form, and there's 6 in the house with 1 in college. And that, we naturally reach out and ask for clarification. So that's typically how we find out here that there are additional family members that have moved back home or are living in the household.
Great, thank you. Susan, how about you?
Mostly, we do see a lot of siblings moving back home. And they went to college, they thought they were going to be able to live on their own, and they don't. So they come back, and we'll allow them in the household as long as they are being supported by the family. I think when I mentioned earlier, grandparents being supported, if they're not necessarily in the house, but the applicant's family can prove that they're supporting that parent or family member more than 50%, we will add them to the household in that regard, even though they're not physically under that roof.
Great. So if they're helping pay for nursing home expenses, things like that.
Right. Exactly.
Great. And I have a quick question. For the older siblings, is there an age limit on how old that sibling can be where you will no longer consider that?
So that age has been increasing over when I started this job.
Yes.
I think we sort of use a guideline of 24, but we know that that's not always helpful anymore. And certainly if there's a disabled sibling in the household and they happen to be in their 30s, that's all bets are off. That's a different story altogether. But generally speaking, if there's a sibling that is not working or not able to support themselves, we will include them in the household.
Great, thank you. Chelsea, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I'd say just speaking from the community college standpoint, there are a lot of adult learners there, and oftentimes, they're welcoming a new baby into the household, and they're not sure how to report that when, if the parent is pregnant with the child, do they include it? Do they include that unborn child on the application? Do they not? And really, if that child is going to be born during that, that period of July 1 to June 30th, and they're going to be supporting that child during that time, then we want that family to report that unborn child in the household. And if that is to change, then we certainly want to know about it. But oftentimes, we'll get this, it's that discrepancy that we see, like Kevin mentioned, where they get selected for verification and they're saying they're one household size, and then you get the verification form and it's saying something else, and then it comes out, oh yeah, we just had a baby, or we have a baby on the way and we weren't sure how to report it. So we were seeing a lot of that situation, but I wouldn't say that families or applicants were forthcoming with the information so much as they were selected for verification and then they weren't consistently reporting it, and so then it came out in that regard.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a couple more slides. I do have a couple question coming about. I'll save it just to get through the next couple slides, and then we'll get into all the questions. So cost of attendance adjustments, sometimes students, if they are able to increase their budget and their cost of attendance, that might make them eligible for more financial aid. We see this frequently on the loan side when families will appeal to the financial aid office to increase their budget so that they can get their loan approved for the full amount they're looking for. We do see that. Susan, I'll start with you. What sort of things do you commonly see where you'll make a cost of attendance adjustment? And what is already included in the cost? Is a computer included?
Okay, so at Wheaton, in our cost of attendance is tuition, room and board, because most of our students are residential, associated fees, a little allowance for personal and books, miscellaneous expenses. So everybody starts with a base budget, but then we'll have students, usually first-year students, who want to get a new computer, and we will allow that extra increased cost in the cost of attendance on a one-time basis. And actually, if they wait and ask us that their sophomore, junior, senior year, that's fine too, but we only allow that for once during their tenure at Wheaton. And generally speaking, that just really allows them gives them additional room to borrow a little bit more to help finance that. We don't typically cover that particular ask with additional institutional grant aid. Sometimes we'll have travel expenses as well. We have a lot of students from the West Coast, and we may allow, a slightly higher budget for them versus a student coming to us from Rhode Island, for example.
Great. And Chelsea, how about you? Are there any of these that you guys see that you'll make adjustments for?
Yeah, I mean, we see it more. I mean, some with undergraduate students, mostly with graduate students, and it ends up being for their living expenses. We use a standard cost of attendance for students living on or off campus. But if it turns out that that student's particular housing expense, whether it's in the dorm or they're renting an apartment, close to campus, if it turns out that their housing expenses are more, if it's on campus, I can go ahead and look at their bill and see what the charge is and go, oh yeah, they're in a single instead of a double, and they've chosen the most expensive meal plan and the most expensive housing option. Then I can go ahead without collecting any documentation and make an increase to their cost of attendance. Typically, I'm only needing to do that if the student has gone out and, say, applied for a private student loan, and they say, hey, I need $10,000. And I look at their cost of attendance, I subtract all the aid they already have, and I say, gee, you're not eligible for $10,000. Let me take a look at your actual charges and see if they're higher than what our standard cost of attendance is. For those students who are living off campus, we would request from them a signed copy of their lease so we could see how much they're paying. The tricky thing is a lot of times these leases are a 12-month lease, and we're talking about a 9-month cost of attendance. So the student is saying, well, I had to start my lease in June, even though I didn't need to be there until the middle or end of August because it was a 12-month lease. And can't you take that into consideration? Well, no, we can only take into consideration the educational expenses associated with the academic period. We can't take into consideration expenses that are outside of that academic period.
Excellent, thank you. And I'll just add that question we get a lot regarding the high cost of living being up here in the Northeast, that is taken into account in the formulas, that the cost of living is obviously higher up here. And I actually was at a financial aid night at Martha's Vineyard, which obviously has a much higher cost of living. Everything's more expensive, milk, bread, everything. And I had a parent who documented the difference between milk, bread, and things like that to show the much higher cost just being on the island. And they were able to successfully appeal to the college, but they had to do all their research about all that difference at just being on the island, not just being in the Northeast, but being there versus being on the mainland was so much more costly, and they were a high need family. So that was helpful to them. So I just throw that out there as an example. But Kevin, do you have anything else to add here that you see?
No, pretty much what Chelsea and Susan covered. One thing we do take into consideration here to add to the cost of attendance is the school's health insurance plan, because it is mandatory that a student have health insurance, and there are certain mass health plans that do not qualify to waive out of the universities. So if a student's in that situation, we will add the health insurance, which is almost $4,000 a year. We'll add that to the budget to kind of free up additional space in the cost of attendance.
Yeah,
Kevin, thank you for. Yeah, we do that too. Thank you for remembering that.
And thank you for mentioning health insurance, because when we're helping families figure out their budget and what they might need to pay, we're often telling them if you have a health plan, you can deduct that $2,000 charge from your costs. So you don't want to pay for that if you don't need to. You want to waive that. So just moving right along, we're almost done here. Any stories, appeals that you've heard we're absolutely most likely not going to consider? I've heard of credit card debt, and what I'll tell families is, if it's unreimbursed medical expenses that you put on the credit card, that might be something to look at, but it's really not the credit card debt, it's the actual expense. But Chelsea, do you have anything to add here as far as things that, you're just not going to look at, or that you get questions about more?
Yeah, I'm currently working with a student here at Clark who, the story, it comes out after you really get into it, but the student committed to enrolling at Clark, was here, had a little bit of savings, used it to pay the first semester, and did have some financial aid, and then came to us and said, oh, but my parents told me before I started that they weren't going to help me because they just bought a new house and it was expensive. So they're not going to help me, and I ran out of money in my savings, and I was wondering what you could do. I'm thinking, well, you kind of knew that before you started, so but this student in particular wanted us to take into consideration that his parents weren't paying, and that they were, I don't want to use the term like prioritizing their housing over their education, but the student already knew that that's the decision that had been made. And we said to him, listen, he hadn't even declined his federal student loans. He had just failed to complete the entrance counseling and the promissory note associated with them. So we had canceled them due to failure to complete requirements. And we said, hey, you have this loan opportunity. As a first-year student, it's only $5,500, but that's not nothing. And if you want to take advantage of it, let us know. So I wouldn't say that was an appeal. That was really just like, hey, you had this loan that you didn't take, and we reinstated the loan. The student repeatedly failed to complete the requirements. We canceled it again, and then he called us last week and said, hey, where's my loan? So, I would say I think his approach to us is that he wanted to appeal based on his parents making a financial decision that prioritized something else over his education. And to us, the answer was no. We didn't even have him pursue the appeal. We just had him pursue the option that had already been made available to him.
Great. Thank you, Chelsea. Good example. Kevin, Susan, anything else to add here?
No, that's about it.
Nope.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I know we're running way over, folks, but this is such a great conversation. So before we end, I do think we should talk quickly about the gap between the need and the aid that's offered. All three of the institutions on the panel in many situations do not meet full need. Very few schools are able to meet full need or will commit to that. And those that are able to meet full need are often need aware in many circumstances. So, a lot of families are looking at not just their family contribution, but also a gap between the need and aid. So Susan, I'll start with you. Would you mind just talking about this issue in general and how you might advise families, the conversation
Yep.
you might have?
So there's two things. There's actual calculated gap or unmet need, and then there's a family's perception of their gap or unmet need. In both situations, we'll sit at Wheaton and counsel the families and the students. The tricky part is, and I think I speak on behalf of my colleagues too, with enrollment management, I would love to give all our families everything they need, but we can't because of our budgets. So step two, or plan B, is to help them figure out, is it a reality? Are they really going to be able to finance with the package that they've been given and the gap that they have? Or is it, should they go to plan C and look at, perhaps going to a community college and transferring into a more expensive college or university? So we do try to give them as many resources as possible. We do talk about that necessary the EVA loan portion of packages, where families a lot of times don't want to talk about, but it is an option. But we also ask them, how many kids are in your household? Are there others that are going to be going to college? Do you want to spend your entire savings account on this first child when you've got some beautiful children right behind them? So I think that's kind of, if I may be so bold as to say, the beauty of having financial aid offices and people that work behind these computers is that we can have those conversations and try and guide them in the right direction.
Great. Yep. Thank you. Chelsea, how about at Clark?
Yep. So at Clark, there's recently been a movement to reduce those gaps. So we've really adjusted our financial aid packaging policies to make, we're not eliminating the gap, but we're saying, all right, for this cohort of students, we're going to make sure that we're not gapping these students more than a certain dollar figure. And for us, we've found that, instead of gapping some students a lot and hoping they'll come and then fully funding others, if we can kind of spread the wealth, we've seen that has positively impacted enrollment. But I think, as Susan said, families see the expected family contribution that the FAFSA spits out, and they probably, panic and have this little heart attack, like, well, I don't know why they think I can afford that. And then their financial aid doesn't reflect that full financial need, and so that gap gets stacked on top of that expected family contribution, and suddenly it's even more than what they were initially panicking about. And so I think that's something that families struggle to understand, is that when we take that cost of attendance, we subtract that expected family contribution and calculate their student's financial need, that doesn't mean that that's what they're going to get in a financial aid award. And I think that that's, a real eye opener to them when that financial aid award comes in the mail and they go, this is what it shouldn't be. It should be more than this. And kind of being able to teach those applicants and those families that that's how the process works. And, every school, might gap more or less or not, that, they really have to understand that that's just how it works. And they shouldn't expect that their expected family contribution is the only amount that they'll pay.
That's great, Chelsea. And I just want to put in a plug for our after the college acceptance programs that we offer in the spring. We're currently starting to schedule those, where we're going to be at about 20 locations across a short 3-week span to help families analyze their financial aid award letters and compare, create a plan to pay. Part of that conversation comes into, choosing the right school at the get-go versus, getting into a situation that they can't afford. And one of those things that we talked to that I'd love Kevin to just touch upon is the Commonwealth commitment and mass transfer, which is always another affordable option through our state college and university system. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. So this is a conversation I have frequently with students, especially incoming first-year students, who they get that sticker shock when they get their financial aid and they get that first bill at the end of June, and realize that there's a lot of money that they're short. And so the way the Commonwealth commitment works is the student commits to attending a community college and receiving their associate degree within 2.5 years. Then once they receive their associate degree, it's an automatic transfer into the 4-year college that they've committed to. So if, for example, a student first year going to North Shore Community College is doing the commitment program, they do that 2.5 years, they get their associate's degree, they automatically transfer into Salem State as a junior. And one of the key things to the commitment, the Commonwealth commitment, is it locks in tuition and fees from the year that they sign the commitment. So when they start at North Shore Community College, they are locking in Salem State's tuition and fees. Tuition, because we're a state school, doesn't go up. It's never gone up. I've been here 16 years. It's $910 a year, which is great. Our fees are almost $5,000 a year, and they increase, $5,000 a semester, so $10,000 a year. They increase between 3 and 7% every year. So by locking in this year's tuition and fees, when that student comes back to us in 2 years, 2.5 years with their associates as a junior, they have 2 more years at this year's tuition and fees. So they've kind of missed, probably a total of 10 to almost 18% increases in those fees over the 2 years that they were away from us. It's a great program. The other part of being part of the Commonwealth commitment is every year they get a rebate on the tuition and fees from Salem State that they pay here and at the community college. So right now at Salem State, they come back in, they complete their year here, they're going to get a 10% rebate on the total of tuition and fees for this academic year and then for the next academic year. It's a great plan for students who really aren't sure what they want to do. I know we're speaking to high school guidance counselors, and it's a difficult conversation to have with the student because their parents are probably my age, our age, maybe a little bit younger. We know what community colleges were like 15, 20 years ago, and they're not like that anymore. Like, they've come so far, but the stigma is still there for some people. So having that conversation and pointing out to the student, look, you're going to go to a community college for 2 years. It's going to cost you maybe $5,000 a year for your tuition, fees, room, and books, etc. Instead of doing 2 years at Salem State, where it's going to cost you $28,000 for 2 years. You're saving a ton of money. All of your credits are going to transfer over to Salem State, and then you're going to have automatic admission to the four-year university of your choice, which is Salem State, we're using them, and be able to continue and get your bachelor's degree. It's a hard sell for a lot of students and for a lot of parents because they want them to have the quote-unquote college experience. But unfortunately, the college experience is also loan debt and payment plans and maybe not being able to afford to go to college after all. One of the biggest fears and one of the biggest things that really upset me about students is they come their freshman year, they do great, they love the campus. Halfway through their sophomore year, the parent says, I can't take out any more loans. And that student has to leave a school that they've grown to love instead of maybe doing 2 years at the community college. And it's a great program. If you go online and just Google Commonwealth Commitment, there's fact sheets. I can actually send one to you, Stephanie, if you want to send it out to the group.
That'd be
But
great.
it's a great option for students, especially students that are undeclared, that are coming into a 4-year as an undeclared. They're not sure what they want to do. This is a great way for them to get their feet wet, to save some money, and to have a guaranteed admission into a 4-year university.
Yeah, it's a great cost savings option. And we do tweet out information about it. It's on all of our social media that you can see right here, as well as emails to parents, school counselors. So make sure you're following us on social. We are going to wrap up right now with a few questions. So, I'll email out this PowerPoint. But here's our email and phone number for after the webinar if you ever need to get in touch with us. And feel free to leave us a Google review. We're trying to get up to 4 stars, 5 stars, I'm sorry. So we're always plugging away for that. So we do have a couple questions. So let me just bring those up real quick. And if anybody else has questions, feel free to type those into the chat feature. So the first question is about scholarship applications that require an EFC or a student aid report, and how counselors should instruct undocumented students to complete the FAFSA. Should they use all zeros in the student social security number? And I'm going to add to that question about parents who might be undocumented. Should they put all zeros so that they can fill out the FAFSA, get the questions answered, and then get an EFC or SAR? So, Susan, can I throw that one over to you?
Yeah, I think that's really the advice that I would give, is to use the zeros in social security number fields just to get that FAFSA processed and out to the scholarship agencies that require it.
Great, thank you. And we do have one more question. So if anybody else has questions, feel free to type those in. Susan, I might throw this one to you too, or Chelsea, Kevin, if any of you can answer this, I might have a little bit to add to it as well. So hopefully, I don't know if you're familiar, but the changes in the NACAC rules going into effect for college financial aid packages are, the NACAC rules.
Yeah, I can certainly speak to how Clark, so NACAC changed their rules. So previously it was that, institutions were to respect one another's deposited students. So if a student had deposited at one institution, other institutions could not continue to pursue that student. And that rule has changed recently with this upcoming academic year and financial aid cycle. And so schools are really struggling to kind of figure out what that frontier is and how things are going to play out this spring and into the summer. Will we have students that have deposited here at Clark, and we're kind of counting on those students to enroll? Will they get pulled away by other institutions who say, hey, here's a little bit more money, or hey, I know you said you were going to another school, but maybe you really want to reconsider us because, one thing or another. And so we don't really know what's going to happen moving forward. We don't really like it. I know here at Clark, we are not planning to poach students who have deposited at other institutions, but we don't really know how institutions will behave in this new landscape.
Yeah, that's great, Chelsea. And Kevin, Susan, do you have anything that you want to add to that topic?
I just want to say ditto what Chelsea said.
Oh, thanks, Susan. Kevin?
And I'll triple that.
Okay,
Yeah.
and I'll just say, basically, just for those who aren't sure what this is about, NACAC, which is the Association of College Admissions Counselors, they have a great code of ethics that has been in place for a long time. And basically, I believe it's the feds were threatening to sue them if they didn't take away a lot of that. So instead of fighting a lawsuit and not having a NACAC anymore, they decided to basically scrap the code of ethics to meet the feds guidelines. But with that opens up all these cans of worms, and the big one, poaching students after they've already deposited in another school is something a lot of colleges are concerned about. I will tell you also that we had a recent panel discussion with some colleges for our admissions presenters that are hitting the road to do presentations, and all three of them also said the same as Susan, Kevin, and Chelsea, that they're not planning on making any changes to their admissions process or enrollment management policies. So for now, it seems like nothing's really changing from what I've heard from multiple schools, but who knows, with enrollment, tight enrollment goals, that may change in the future. But just to finish up that question, it looks like nobody's planning on making changes, at least to those we've talked to. So that's good news. All righty, everybody. So I know this was a very long webinar. We went way over, and I apologize for that, but every word that was spoken was valuable for everybody on board. So I thank our panelists, Susan, Chelsea, and Kevin. Thank you for taking the time. We know students are back on campus and everything's crazy at campus, so MEFA really appreciates you taking the time out. And want to thank everybody for attending. I'll send a copy of the PowerPoint, the webinar recording, and the Commonwealth commitment sheet so that everybody has those resources. And if you do have any questions, feel free to send them to this email and we can get those questions answered for you. But thank you, everybody. I'm going to end the webinar now, and I want to thank our panelists again for joining us, and I hope this is very useful. Have a wonderful day, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.